So I'm going to try and be completely real with you here. I've really gone back and forth quite a bit on whether or not I should even talk about this, mainly because it's a personal issue, a mental health issue, and as we know, there's a lot of stigma attached to that. But ultimately, I think that by sharing my story, it has the potential to help others who might hear it. Even if only one person listens to this and benefits from it, then I think it'll be worth it. And I know that because if it hadn't been for someone else choosing to share their story years ago and publicly, then it might have taken me much longer to feel that sense of relief, to know that I wasn't alone and that things could get better. So I'm going to try and pass that along now. So here's my story of how I believe my OCD started, how it progressed over time, and how I dealt with it. It all starts with a story back in 1991 or 1992, which means I was only 5 or 6 years old at the time. And my dad, who's retired now, but he was a welder by trade and spent over 30 years in that line of work. And the work is inherently dangerous, and there's always a potential for serious injury if you're not careful. Now, when you're 5 or 6 years old, you don't want your dad to get hurt, and you want him to be safe. I remember my dad would sometimes come home from work with some minor injuries from hot steel that he's working with, or cuts or bruises. And like he had explained to me before, accidents happened. But I don't think my kid brain was ready to accept that just yet. So each morning before he would head out for work, I'd give him a hug and make sure to tell him, "Dad, be careful at work today. Love you," each and every morning. And it almost became some sort of ritual for me. And I don't recall exactly when I started doing this, but I do know that I did it for a really long time. And every time I'd see him coming home from work with some kind of burn or injury after work, the more important it became to complete this ritual. I think I eventually became convinced that my words had power. I had the power to actually protect my dad simply by reminding him to stay safe at work. And if I didn't tell him, he'd forget, and God knows what could happen. And this is where I think it all started for me. So anyways, one morning before school, maybe I was distracted with a cartoon I was watching, or maybe he was in a rush to head out for work that day, who knows. But that morning he left, and it suddenly occurred to me that I hadn't given him this important reminder. And I started to panic. And I shouted to my mom, "Is Dad gone? I didn't tell him to be safe today." And she said, "That's okay, Brian. Don't worry about your dad. He'll be fine. Nothing to worry about." But she didn't really seem to understand or to grasp my situation. So I tried again. "Mom, Dad is going to hurt himself. I got to tell him." And her attempts to reassure me really weren't working. This back and forth went on for quite a while between me and her. You've got to understand the immense sense of worry and urgency I was feeling here as a child. This was before emails and text messages and cell phones. There was no easy fix, but my mom tried her best to kind of settle me down, and soon it was time to leave for school. I promised her that I would do my best to just kind of let it go, just as long as she could promise me that she'd call Dad at work and give him his reminder. So once we made our deal, she dropped me off at school, and soon all that worry and anxiety I felt, it faded away, and I was able to go about my day like any first grader should. So the school day came and went, and before I knew it, I was back home. And soon I get to greet my dad at the front door, as I often did when he would return from work. But today it felt especially important, considering I hadn't been able to give him my reminder that morning. Suddenly the phone rings. My mom answers, but something feels off because she sounds worried. As soon as she hangs up, I run over to her, and she tells me that there's been an accident at work and that Dad was hurt. I'd later learned that he cut his hand pretty deeply, but somehow he had managed to drive himself to the hospital. Usually every kid thinks that their father is the baddest and strongest man around, but in his case, and to his credit, he really was and still is one really tough and strong guy, even now that he's in his 70s. And of course, he loves hearing that, and it's guaranteed to go straight to his head. "Hey, Dad." So as a kid, learning that my dad, my personal Superman, was hurt, bad enough to have to go to the hospital, That's some scary stuff for a kid. And I kept thinking, how bad was the cut? Was he going to be okay? And soon after those initial thoughts, I started to blame myself. If I would have told him to be careful at work, then none of this would have ever happened. I was relieved when he got home, but seeing his hand all wrapped up in thick white bandages made his injury really real to me. And it was a stark contrast to his usual strong, invincible demeanor. Thankfully, it turned out that my dad was going to be fine, but you can bet that I wasn't going to forget to give him his reminder ever again. Although it might not sound like much, that experience really stuck with me for a while. And I believe it might have been the event which triggered the start of my OCD habits. And soon it would start to kind of pop up in other ways in my life. Not too long after that, I'm out with my mom. Hey, Mom. And we're running the usual errands, probably at our local Zellers or something like that. And shout out to my fellow Canadians old enough to know what a Zellers is. And although I might have had the official title of being her helper, all I was really doing was trying to keep myself entertained. And in an attempt to make the most of an otherwise pretty boring situation, I always enjoyed letting my imagination run wild. I used to love to pretend that I was some kind of ninja or a ninja turtle, ducking in and out of the middle of clothing racks while my mom shopped. And I always felt like a win if I could do that without any shoppers noticing that I was actually there. And as I followed my mom around, I imagined that the lines which divided the large, glossy sheet flooring of the store were actually lasers. And I pretended that if I stepped on those lines, it would either, burn my feet right off or set off some kind of trap and, I'd be done for. And it wasn't just my neck that was on the line. My mom was also in danger. I had turned an ordinary walk around a store into an obstacle course. But soon my ego would find a very creative way to kind of raise the stakes and turn it into a game of life and death. So as crazy as it sounds, the thought that popped into my head was, if I can't avoid these lines with my feet, then my mom would die. Simple as that. She'd die. And I had no idea how she would die. I knew there weren't any actual lasers or traps lying around. I knew I had made it all up in my head, but there was still a deep sense of fear that came over me, which made me believe that I had to do this in order to prevent anything bad from happening to my mom. I mean, what else could explain this intense sinking feeling in my stomach? I was convinced that something terrible would happen and I'd lose her in some way if this ritual of avoiding the floor lines wasn't followed. It wasn't a game to me anymore. And the joy and playfulness that I once felt was now replaced with a strong sense of anxiety and unease. These were emotions that, as a child, I had little to no experience with, but I would get to know them quite well for years to come. And my OCD seemed to get worse as I got older, and I struggled more and more to maintain a sense of control over the unpredictability of life. I experienced loss for the first time with the passing of my grandmother, and eventually the passing of other relatives and family friends. And hearing tragic stories of lives that have been cut short and love stories coming to an end because of death seemed to kind of paralyze me inside. And I imagined what it must be like to go through that kind of pain, that kind of deep sadness. And I wondered how in the world would I be able to cope if and when that kind of loss ever happened to me. And it wasn't until much later that I hear about secondary trauma and how strongly it can affect people, especially children. But for years, I acted out a long list of rituals and obsessive behaviors, which were designed by me with the intent to help control the future outcomes of life. And these were all completely useless, of course, but I really believed them. I believed that they were actual strategies that could also keep my fears and worries in check. But in reality, it only ended up making them more powerful. Maybe some of these behaviors or rituals will be familiar to you, like repeatedly passing over the letters of my homework in grade school, over and over and over again, out of fear that it might not be easily visible to the teacher and somehow affect my scores. And before I knew it, I had, paragraphs of words written out in thick, inky blue lines, And it just looked awful, so I'd end up having to start over. And it became this vicious cycle of obsessive repetition. And then there was, checking the kitchen and bathroom taps multiple times after using them to make sure that they were closed properly. Making sure that the drain plugs, weren't pushed down too tightly so that if a leak ever happened overnight or while we were away somewhere, that the house wouldn't flood. And that always made me think of the wet bandits from Home Alone.
You did it again, didn't you? You left the water running, didn't you?
All the great ones leave their mark. We're the wet bandits.
You're sick, you know that? You're really sick.
Making sure that the door to the fridge was shut and sealed, checking multiple times out of fear that we'd wake up in the morning to find out that all the food had gone bad. I know it makes no sense, but that's what I thought. Checking and rechecking that the front door was locked before bed, and turning the doorknob 3 to 4 times to make sure it was locked whenever I left the house. Studying for exams and writing essays in university were especially draining on me. I'd find myself repeatedly reading paragraphs and even full pages, over and over again, not because I didn't grasp or understand it, but because I felt that I had to read it in a certain way, or else I wouldn't be able to kind of commit it to memory, and I would end up, failing my exam. And I dreaded having to prepare reference lists of my sources for every essay that I wrote because of the specific way that the sources had to be listed. And this was before apps and software made it, such a breeze. It would sometimes take me hours, literally hours, to finish my reference lists. And maybe the most embarrassing one to admit to would be the ridiculous amounts of time and energy I spent on deciding on, wait for it, the color of my underwear. Yeah, you heard that right. I felt that if I didn't pay attention to this detail every day, then things would go very bad. I'd either fail on whatever was important in my life or on that day, or that my parents would die. If I didn't take it seriously, then my parents would die. If I tried to dismiss the idea, then my parents would die. If I didn't choose the color which felt, just right for that day, you got it, they'd die. And I know it sounds completely crazy and makes absolutely no sense, but it's actually what I thought and how I felt, and it became part of my morning routine for years as I got ready for class. So if you're going through anything like this right now, trust me, I get it. It is not fun. I know. In university, I had decided to do a minor in psychology. I'm especially interested in a class on abnormal psychology, so I purchased my textbook and I start, skimming through the pages, and I land on a section about obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD for short. And I was really surprised after I finished reading through a section in chapter 7 of that book. It details the story of a guy named Mark Summers who had a very successful career in television. And he wrote an autobiography called Everything in Its Place. And in it, he talks about the experiences with this anxiety disorder, which tends to revolve around cleanliness and orderliness. And this excerpt that I'll read to you in just a minute is what struck me, because he's this young kid, but he's carrying this immense sense of responsibility for keeping his parents safe. And the only way you can shake that feeling or get any sense of relief from these thoughts is by doing these very specific rituals. So here it is from page 42 of this textbook, which I'll reference in the description. On page 42 of Mark's book, he writes, "I thought my parents would die if I didn't do everything in exactly the right way. When I took my glasses off at night, I'd have to place them on the dresser at a particular angle. Sometimes I'd turn on the light and get out of bed 7 times until I felt comfortable with the angle. If the angle wasn't right, I felt that my parents would die. The feeling ate up my insides. If I didn't grab the molding on the wall just the right way as I entered or exited my room, if I didn't hang a shirt in the closet perfectly, if I didn't read a paragraph a certain way, if my hands and nails weren't perfectly clean, I thought my incorrect behavior would kill my parents." And that's the moment I was finally able to name what it was that I was experiencing for the first time. And I gotta say that I felt an incredible sense of relief to know that I wasn't alone and that I wasn't crazy. That other people, even very successful people like him, struggled with this as well. And I felt empowered to take this on and to find ways to address it and to work through it. That then led me down a path of self-help books, eventually landing on one which would become one of my favorites of all time, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you check it out. The book served as an incredible guide to help me see that there's a difference between using your thoughts and imagination to create and to have fun, but it's an entirely different story when your mind starts to come up with things to create negative emotions, and the really serious and unhealthy kinds. It's a form of human suffering, but not the kind that you would normally associate with someone of such a young age. But the thing that many people don't realize about OCD is that this can happen to anyone at any age and at any point in their lives. So if this is something that you're struggling with, please know that there is hope. And my message to you is this: you are not your thoughts. And the voice that's making you believe that something will go terribly wrong if you don't do this or you don't do that, that voice is not you. It's not you. And once you begin to differentiate between your true self and the negative, fearful thoughts which arise out of the ego, you'll be on your way to improvement. A big thanks for sticking around to the end. If you're interested, you might want to check out another video I have. It's called 5 Steps to Improve Your OCD. I hope you'll find it helpful. All the best, take care of yourself, and until next time.